Hi, hello. So, we are going to try to get through as much of this as possible um, as quickly as I can so that you guys can get on to your other class stuff. But welcome to your snow day at home, and I hope that you guys are keeping warm. So, what we are going to be going over today is two things. One, the market revolution, which basically means the expanding of the economy and the market during the early 1800s, basically from the end of World War, or sorry, not World War, the end of the War of 1812 through like the 1830s or so. And then we're also going to cover the Second Great Awakening, which runs for an even longer time period, but I'll get to that. So, first, the market revolution, and specifically, we'll focus in on Henry Clay and the American system. So, what are some of these big economic developments? Well, to give you some background to some big ones, one would be the cotton gin. So, the cotton gin, we talked a little bit about last class, but in 1793, Eli Whitney, who was a Yale student, moved to the South to try to make some more money and worked with a plantation owner to create the cotton gin. And he invented a process that would basically roll cotton through a machine that would remove the seeds much, much, much quicker than anyone could do it by hand. Excuse me. So that's going to greatly increase the rate at which people can produce usable cotton from raw cotton. And this is going to lead to a huge increase in cotton production and to more plantations. So, as the westward expansion continues across the United States, especially in the South, that is going to lead to an expansion of slavery because there is an expansion of cotton production. So, the cotton production itself will lead to an expansion of slavery because slavery had been basically dying out. It had been slowly coming to an early death in the late 1700s, early 1800s, because it wasn't as profitable and because the crops that relied on slavery didn't necessarily need to have the same huge investment in human capital. But with the expansion of slavery, it took a lot of human labor to grow and harvest cotton. So, therefore, that is why there was a huge expansion once the cotton gin was invented. All of a sudden, cotton becomes extremely profitable. They can sell it everywhere. They can sell it to Europe, sell it to the North. And that is going to mean that slavery will, instead of dying out, will expand. And so we see an increased reliance on slavery in the South rather than it relenting. In addition to it being expanded, it also is going to get worse. The harshness by which slaves were treated, especially the field labor, and especially in the deep South. Like, so deep South, picture like southern Alabama, Mississippi, northern Florida, when Texas is got well, when Texas is annexed by the U.S., that will also be a place where this will take place. But also South Carolina, North Carolina. The deep South is where things get really, really bad, especially because the harshness of the treatment. The plantations are so big, and the monotony of the work for slaves has increased. So most slaves are now field laborers, even though there are still some artisans and still some who are employed in shops or in, not employed, sorry, wrong word, but are forced to work in shops or as house laborers. By far the majority now are going to be field laborers working, picking cotton, which is hot, dry, dusty, monotonous, day after day work. Okay, so then we also see in the other side of the country in the Northeast, partially connected to this because it takes cotton to create textiles, but the textile manufacturing industry is going to really take off here. And it started taking off during the embargo period because during the War of 1812, or right before, when American companies were trying to, fill in the gap from what they weren't being able to buy from the mainland or from mainland Europe, the France or England specifically. Now we are going to produce our own, and that means that the American manufacturing will take off. And part of this is because some of these machines that will create a larger production ability for textiles, meaning fabric, are actually stolen from British plants, British manufacturing plants by the guys who create the Lowell, Massachusetts factories. So they were spying on the British textile factories and then brought the knowledge back and were able to establish factories in Massachusetts. And this is quickly going to spread all over New England so that the New England's main source of economic growth is going to be in manufacturing. And don't hear really big factories yet, but as you can see in the picture, and this is the largest one in the United States for a while, it is going to be a factory setting where people will actually live and work on the premises, and they'll have big machines to work with, rather than before this, textile production was happening in people's homes. People would take, there might be a central building or central factory, but people would take the work home, do it at home, and then bring it back to the factory to be pieced together by somebody else. Well, now it's all going to happen in one location. And part of this is because the geography in New England is really conducive to having factories, because there was natural water power. There's so many rivers and fast flowing rivers that they could set up a plant along a riverside, as you see in the picture, and use the natural power of the river to power the plant. So this is going to become the center of U.S. manufacturing, relying on cotton from the South. In addition to this being a big change and an increase in the market economy, there's also going to be an increase in the use of interchangeable parts for lots of different things. Watches would be one. Like, you can imagine how much easier it would be to fix your watch if you could just go buy one part rather than having to send your whole watch away to get fixed by somebody who could do it specially. So, like, easy repair, cheaper. This is really going to take off in the 1830s, a little bit later than the textile industry, but still important. Another big economic development is, of course, the movement west, because as we have been talking about throughout not just this unit, but throughout the entirety of the year, movement west is going to open up opportunities for white settlers. It's going to change the way that the different parts of the country interact with each other. And as people move west, the frontier moves. So the painting up at the corner of your screen is one of the most famous American paintings. It is basically the embodiment of this concept of manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were just going to continue to move west until they had taken the entirety of the continent in hand, so that the entirety of the continent would become an American continent. The from sea to shining sea type picture. And in this painting, what makes it so famous is, one, you have like this visual embodiment of this woman in the sky as like progress, but you also have, the Native Americans in the front, and the buffalo, or technically bison, I know we call them buffalo, but they're actually bison, being pushed west, and the destruction of those societies. But you also have, the chronological progress. So what is next? Well, we have the wagons and people walking, and then after that, further towards the right, you see trains, which would have come along later chronologically. So it's a picture that comes along not during this time period, but later, to embody what was happening during this time period. The federal government was buying Indian land, which means there's less land for Native Americans. This is happening in the territories in like Indiana and Iowa, but it's also going to take place in Louisiana Purchase and further out. And we also know that while at times it is the federal government buying the land, sometimes it is also white settlers just moving onto the land and then coming into conflict with Native Americans fighting back against that taking of their land. And then the greater conflict is pretty much always going to be, the story will end with Native Americans being pushed farther west, or later on in the 1800s getting pushed onto reservations. There will be smaller successes by different Native American tribes throughout that period, but the bigger picture story is that, as you know from looking at a map of any present-day United States, that there are a lot of reservations in the West, but in the Midwest and in the East, most of that land is all taken. So most of the story is of white settlement taking over through the support of the federal government. But it's more complicated than that on the inside. But anyway, big picture. So another thing that's happening is that fur trade is still taking place, and a famous person you guys may have heard of, John Jacob Astor, is building trading posts for fur trading, and this is kind of taking the place of the French fur traders who had always been out there in the West. Charbonneau, who is Sacagawea's husband, would be one example. But we also have the Lewis and Clark's route that he can follow now and set up for trading. He's going to set up a big post in Astoria. So the city of Astoria in Oregon is one of the earliest cities in the West, and it is basically a trading post at the mouth of the Columbia where people will be sailing ships to trade, but also the land trade will allow for furs to be deposited there and then sold onward. So Astoria, named after John Jacob Astor, is an important part of Oregon's history, but also U.S. history. And then not the Canadian and U.S. border that is right, north of us, but the Canadian and U.S. border closer by, like Minnesota and northern North Dakota. That was all in dispute. I think I showed you that on an earlier map, but that whole area was still in dispute. There wasn't a set line. So Canada, or in this case, Britain, who still owned Canada, and the U.S. set the border at the 49th parallel. So it was just it's a flat line basically until you get to the Great Lakes. And they also agreed to jointly occupy Oregon Territory. Later on, in the 40s, they will also decide that the 49, why don't we just continue that 49 degree the whole way across? But they don't decide that right away. They're going to argue over it for a while, so we'll come back to that. But they do jointly occupy the Oregon Territory. And then we have the whole issue of, okay, well, what is going to happen with all of this land? Remember, the Louisiana Purchase is ginormous, but we also have other land still in the territories, which is still owned by the federal government. Well, the federal government would like to sell that to farmers, because the investment, the way that helps the country, producing food, producing an export product, all of that is something the government wants, that westward development and economic growth. But land speculation here is a problem, because it's not just farmers who want to buy up the land, it is also land speculators. These are people who are going to buy the land, sometimes not even with money of their own, but with money they have borrowed, and then they're going to hold on to that land until the prices have gone up and they can sell it at a profit, sometimes a huge profit, to farmers who now are moving into the West and want that land. So this is going to drive up costs. It's also going to kind of artificially inflate what the land is worth at that point in time. And it's going to lead to a depression. Basically, this is a time period called the Panic of 1819. There's several of these panics throughout the 1800s where some kind of speculation or borrowing is going to lead to the prices being driven up and then kind of the bottom falling out. And in this case, this is due to land speculation. Also because the farmers were borrowing borrowing money to pay for the equipment to farm that land, especially as things become slightly more mechanized. There's equipment available they would like to buy, but this is all costing more than they can afford. And if all of a sudden the prices drop out, and at the same time the Europeans have kind of recovered from the Napoleonic Wars, and they are going to not need to buy as much American goods. When all of that coincides at the same time, there's less of a market, things are expensive, the banks are getting nervous, and they start to call in loans on the farmers. And they don't just call in the loans in any old way, they call them in gold, which is not something the farmers are going to have on hand. So this is really difficult for American farmers, and it's going to lead to one of these depressions or major recessions that's going to take place throughout the 1800s. So Panic of 1819 is going to lead to kind of a downturn of this market revolution. But the big picture is still this massive expansion, and that's not going to stop the market revolution from continuing. So one person who is heavily involved in all of this is a guy named Henry Clay. And Henry Clay, along with two other senators during this, like the first half of the 1800s, a guy named John C. Calhoun, as well as a guy named Daniel Webster, the three of them are going to be like the powerhouses of the Senate for this first half of the century, and they are very influential, probably the most influential senators of all time. And I will come back to the other two of them next class. But Henry Clay, in addition to being one of these architects of some of the compromises that takes place over the course of the 1800s before we get to the Civil War, he is also the architect of something called the American system. And it's basically a 3-point plan that he had that was going to stabilize and improve the U.S. economy. And some of this gets implemented by the U.S. government. All of it gets implemented by the country at large. But the first one is a strong tariff, or a protective tariff, that is going to protect American goods. So we have this young manufacturing industry. We have the Western farmers who are largely producing foodstuff, and we have the South who is largely producing cotton and tobacco. So all of this could benefit from a protective American tariff. This is what Clay believes. And you guys read about this in your last document that I gave you. I can't remember what number it was, but it was the last document that you read before we left on Friday. And if you haven't finished that, then please do finish the Henry Clay, his speech that he gave about the American system. It's talking about what he believes are the benefits to the tariff, why it's helping the American economy, and why those who are advocating for free trade and for killing the tariff are actually going to hurt the economy. So in this case, he's saying we need to be able to charge more on imported British or French or anybody else's goods, because it protects the American industry. It protects our young manufacturers, but it also protects our farmers, because then when they don't have to deal with an influx of cheaper products coming from Europe or from somewhere else, they can sell at a fair price, and it helps to protect the economy. That's his belief. Now, the free trade guys are largely coming from the South, and they are largely arguing against the tariff because they believe that it's going to inspire a retaliatory tariff over in Europe. So we'll charge a harsh one, they will charge a harsh one, and we won't be able to sell our cotton to Europe for the same benefit. Also, a lot of Southerners weren't buying American products from the North. They were buying imported products from Europe. So all of a sudden, the stuff they want to buy is going to cost a lot more. So this is the arguments that they are making for free trade. Now, we'll come back to that, but for the second point of his plan, it is to charter the Second National Bank. If you remember, Hamilton's first national bank had a 20-year charter, and it had become unpopular towards the end, and the charter was allowed to run out. So in the wake of the War of 1812, Henry Clay is going to get the Second National Bank through Congress, and we will have a Second National Bank. And again, to help stabilize the economy, be a place for tax dollars to be accumulated, to kind of like control trade and lending to the state banks, which are starting to become much more prevalent around this time. We went from like almost none of the state having state banks to having hundreds now. So this is going to help regulate some of that, and this does get through. And then his third point is to improve the country's infrastructure. And this would be foundational. And I talked about this last class, but foundational to everything else getting better is the infrastructure getting better. So roads and canals, having the ability to ship goods. It's no good having all this food in the West if you can't get it anywhere to sell. It's no good having manufacturing plants in the Northeast if you cannot get them to the sea so you can ship things around the country or ship things to Europe. So in addition to the benefit to the economy, it's also going to help unite the nation. So Henry Clay believes that this is going to bring the nation together. The disparate parts of the nation will heal and come together if we can transport much more quickly between places. So there's his 3 points. That's the American system. The first two do happen. There's a strong national tariff passed in 1816. There will be some more. National bank happens. And then the country's infrastructure happens, but it doesn't happen through the national government, largely because Madison, who is president at the time, is going to veto the big spending, aside from something called the National Road. The National Road is going to go through the Appalachian Mountains. It's very impactful. It helps to quicken transportation times, but the rest of the spending products, specifically like helping pay for canals like New York's Erie Canal, those he's going to say that's beyond what the federal government should be spending its money on. It's too much of an expansion of federal power. So the New York Erie Canal, which is the biggest canal in the United States and one of the most impactful throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, is paid for by New York State and through private investment. One thing that Henry Clay said, he said this much later, like on the eve of the Civil War. Well, not the eve, maybe like 1850, but close. He said, "I know no South, no North, no East, no West, to which I owe any allegiance. I owe allegiance to two sovereignty, or two sovereignties, spelling wise, and only two. One is the sovereignty of this union, and the other is the sovereignty of the state of Kentucky, which is who he represented in Congress." So I like the phrasing here. I think even though he's saying it in basically telling people, I'm not going to support a confederacy, I'm supporting the Union. If you apply it to what he was believing earlier about the transportation and the way that was going to bring the country together, he's wanting the country to be split into all these sections. He's saying we shouldn't owe allegiance to these different sections. We owe allegiance to, the state that he's representing, but we're owing allegiance to the country as a whole. But sectionalism developed anyway, not and in some cases, kind of because of pieces of the American system and how they pushed people farther apart from each other. So in this case, sectionalism related to North, South, and West. And the map I have up here is labeled with the emerging West, and I'm choosing that one because the West is always changing. As more and more people move to different portions of the West, the frontier is no longer in the same spot. What used to be the frontier is now settled country. So largely what we're talking about with the West at the time is kind of like the Midwest. So even the parts that are labeled in the north here, like this area where we would have Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Iowa, all of those places would still be West at this point in time, even though over here that would be labeled as North. But the North at this point in time is basically like New England, which is up here, and then New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and then the South would obviously be the rest. So like Virginia and Maryland, south to the new states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and so on. So the three regions are all developing their own kind of niche markets or specialized markets. So we have the New England with their finished goods, the manufactured goods, the South with its cotton and tobacco, and the West, which is producing a lot of food stuff, whether that be wheat and corn, other food products. The South generally is the one who is going to oppose the protective tariffs the most. Some in the West do too, but for the most part, the West and the North are able to elect enough representatives to basically override the South's votes in Congress. They have enough people there representing in Congress that they can get it through. And so these tariffs that are unpopular in the South are passed in 1816, again in 1824, and even more so in 1828. That one actually gets nicknamed the Tariff of Abomination by the South, which is a great name. But basically because the South by this point in time is convinced that the other two parts of the country are out to get them, and it is becoming a very sectional divide. And in fact, it is so bad that we almost reached the point of civil war here in the early 1830s. And I'll come back to what is called the nullification crisis in another lecture. But basically, we are so mad in the South that the tariff is still being passed that part of the South South Carolina tries to nullify it, basically saying we don't have to agree, we don't have to pass it, and things almost come to blows. But the nullification crisis does pass, and we don't end up with a civil war at this point in time. But this whole idea that sectionalism is dividing the country, so each section is being more and more loyal to their section rather than viewing their section as just one piece of the whole and being loyal to the country. There really is a lot of divisiveness and major splits going on here, and partially due to this tariff that again comes back to the American system and Henry Clay's ideas about how to help the whole country develop. He thought it was beneficial to the South too. The South vehemently disagrees, especially as time goes on and the tariff gets larger. So this is a big piece of what's going to lead to the Civil War, but we're not there yet. So I'm going to move on and continue to talk about the market stuff. But one thing that is also related here, it has to do with the expansion of the country and the adding of states, but it also has to do with this idea of what does each section, what is the biggest thing that is dividing each section. And in this case, the biggest thing is slavery. And slavery is the biggest divisive issue between the North and Southern states, basically from the time period of the Revolutionary War. One of the bigger things that divides those areas, but it doesn't become so antagonistic section versus section until we get to here the 1800s. And again, remember, we just got the cotton gin in the 1790s. So now slavery is deepening and the reliance on slavery is deepening. So the slave states who are still slave states are even more antagonistic against the free states and more defensive of wanting slavery, and not just wanting slavery to keep it where it is, because if they had just wanted to keep it where it was, it probably wouldn't have caused the same kind of issues. It's the expansion of slavery. It's the desire to make slavery expand into all of this new territory that is going to cause the biggest of these issues leading into the Civil War. So we already have this underlying base of sectionalism, and now add to it this idea that what is the biggest difference? It is slavery. And you can see in the map that we have all these slave states, and then we have the free states in the north. But then take a look here. This is where Missouri is. And when Missouri wants to become a state, remember there are rules for becoming a state. We have to get a certain number of people. So when Missouri wants to, has the number of people required for statehood, and they want to become a state, there are people who have moved into Missouri, many of them, who own slaves. So there's a push for Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state. But all of this territory around it, you can see this is free states. So we now have Illinois here next door. And then we also have the Northwest Territory up here, which was already made free by the Northwest Ordinance. We talked about that a long time ago. And then we have the Louisiana Territory up here. And the whole free states, they don't want to see slavery up here. They have all banned slavery. Slavery is illegal. And they don't want to see it expand, because expansion of slavery will bring expansion to this whole culture and ideas of the South, which is the opposite in many cases of what some of the northern states are really dedicated to. Not just in terms of slavery, but also in terms of economy and the way that the economy is organized in terms of increasing prosperity that doesn't rely on slavery. So this was a very contentious issue. Henry Clay is again at the heart of deciding this compromise that is going to let Missouri in and not break the Union, because again, this is another huge thing that could have ended in Civil War. It's actually earlier than the Tariff of Abominations. This is in 1820. So this is the southern line of Missouri right here is at the 3630 parallel. And so what it was ultimately decided is that all of this territory up here will get to remain free because all of these territories are north of that 3630 line. Now, Missouri is north of that 3630 line, but then Missouri becomes the exception. So Missouri can be admitted as a slave state even though it is north of the 3630 line. But all of the rest of this territory that is north of 3630, including, if you notice, any of this territory in the Spanish possessions that America might eventually get its hands on, would also be admitted as a free state. Now, that's the rule made in 1820. However, things are going to change, and this is the first of several compromises that will happen throughout the 1800s to avoid civil war. It's not not where things end, but it is the where circumstances lie as of 1820. Arkansas has not been admitted as a state yet, in case you're wondering why it's not a slave state yet, but it will be. It's just not a state yet. So Missouri, the 3630 line, north of it free, south of it could enter as a slave state. It's not that it has to. They just will, because slavery is moving out this direction pretty consistently during this time period, again because of the expansion of cotton. Okay, so coming back to the market revolution here for a second, just closing out with some stats. So what are some stats? Well, we got 5 weeks to 2 weeks. We have travel time throughout the Union. So think about like one of the bigger cities in the West, St. Louis, and the biggest city on the East Coast, New York. So what is the connection there? If somebody wanted to travel that distance in 1800, it would take 5 weeks, maybe more, depending on the conditions. So this is arduous travel over the Appalachian Mountains, on wagons, rough roads. All of it's taking a long time. By the time we get to 1830, that national road had been built through the Appalachians. So that travel time has been drastically reduced to 2 weeks, and a much more comfortable 2 weeks, with the roads being a lot nicer. So that's one example of something that's changing during this time period. Another thing is, I talked briefly about the state chartered banks. There was one in the 1780s, 266 in 1820. By the time we get to the 1840s, there's going to be 700 state chartered banks. So that's another way the economy is increasing and expanding. Another example is through these inventions. The steamboat was invented by Robert Fulton in 1807, and by 1830, there's going to be 200 steamboats operating in like the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. So there's a lot of action. There's a lot of commerce that is made possible by this. And then finally, the first long-distance railroad is built by 1837, and it reaches from Baltimore, this city in Maryland, out towards the Ohio River. Now, it doesn't reach the Ohio River until 1852, but it is expanding commerce in the region by the late 1830s. So important developments demonstrating how the economy is really growing. Different kinds of commerce is growing. Lots going on. Okay, completely shifting gears now and actually going back in time to talk about the Second Great Awakening. And if you are very tired of taking notes, this is a shorter section of notes, I promise. So the Second Great Awakening, shorter than the market revolution. I didn't mean that to, I don't want to mislead you. This will still take me a few minutes, but shorter than what I just did. Okay, so the Second Great Awakening. This is a religious revival. So I want to set this up by talking about some of the population growth and changes that are happening during this time. So American population growth, 4 million people in 1790. That was our population estimate. And by the time we get to 1840, it'll be 17 million. Now, if you look at the graph to the right, you'll see that this will continue to tick up, and the pace will continue to increase throughout the 1800s and 1900s. So the pace is still lower here than it used to be, but it's still a significant increase over that point in time. In 1790, only about 10% of Americans regularly attended church. Some of that is because a lot of people didn't live near a church. If you lived farther out towards the frontier, the church would come to you in terms of an itinerant pastor maybe once every couple of months. But a lot of people who lived in the cities were not attending church as regularly as maybe people had earlier in the 1700s. And this is something that is also part of that time period, and a lot of the rationalism, and the Enlightenment time period. Things have gotten things, as well as like kind of like the impermanence of the new country and people feeling maybe just a little bit a lack of center. Things are exciting, but things have also changed a lot since America became a new country. So that people being spread out, lack of permanence, maybe leads to a decline in church attendance. And the spreading out of the population has also taken place. So all of that to say, in the 1790s, major evangelism and revival starts taking place. And a lot of the paintings that I have put up here are of camp meetings, but not all of it took place in camp meetings. So in New England, this revival really begins just like kind of naturally in these local congregations, with sometimes the pastors would like trade off trade with another pastor, and they would switch congregations for a week or something. But for the most part, this was happening in local churches, just massive amounts of people starting to coming to church and explaining or experiencing that they had these experiences with God and coming to Christ, and church membership was increasing, and people were holding meetings throughout the week, and talking about how they were becoming closer to God, and all of this great stuff was happening kind of naturally in the New England churches. In the West, it was also happening, but in a different way, because again, in the West, they didn't have as many established churches because people just lived so much farther away from each other. They didn't live nearby a church much of the time. So in the West, it began with these itinerant preachers going around from place to place and establishing these camp meetings that would bring people to them. So instead of like everybody coming to church, a preacher would set up a camp meeting, and people would all come from their homes to the woods for a couple of days. Like they'd be camping in the woods for a couple of days, and over the course of a couple of days, they'd be hearing preaching and songs, and people would be speaking and prayer meetings, and there was just a lot going on. And these were bringing revival too. So mass numbers of people declaring faith in Christ, repentance. There's an emphasis on repentance and putting off sin. And then as this is happening kind of a little by little in the West, it becomes more of then we start to intentionally organize all of these camp meetings. And there's a lot of different denominations would organize camp meetings, and preachers and pastors all over the country. And sometimes they would last up to a week long. And they're, again, happening out in the woods, much like you see in the painting. They would build some kind of a platform by which the preachers could talk and people could see them. They would clear some of the land. They'd set up tents. And people would come and stay, and revival was spreading. And part of it was, there's an emotional aspect to people are experiencing something, and so then they want to come back for it and want to tell their friends about it, and people want to come to the camp meeting so that they can experience something. If you think about how isolating it could be, especially to live on the Western frontier, this would be a huge change and something that people would really look forward to, and at the same time have this connection with God. And it was also a spiritual impact, like hundreds of people at a time coming to God, and the emphasis being on, sorry, I'll switch slides here. Come back to that one. The emphasis being on the need for personal salvation, an emphasis on prayer, an emphasis on action. Like, what action do you take as a result of having an experience like this? So these revivals are all over the country, the Northeast, the South, the West especially, and into like the Midwest. So very, very impactful time in history. Coming back here, this is from, if we were in class today, we would be doing some more of these can't think of the word, activity packets where I had a lot more sources for you. And one of them is from a preacher named Andrew Reed, who himself was very skeptical. Like, part of it is about him, kind of describing what the scene looks like, but also he's just very skeptical. He came from England, and he thought, there's no way this is real. And he did not want to get swept up by emotion. He thought the emotionality of the camp meetings was basically insincere. And then he was asked to preach, and he preaches at the end of one of these camp meetings. And at the end of his own sermon, people are experiencing emotion and experiencing like a need for prayer. And so then another pastor comes up and says, hey, like, if anybody wishes to, I'll just read the quote. He would therefore propose that if such persons wish to acknowledge the impression received and to join in prayer for their personal salvation, they should show it by kneeling down, and he would pray with them. And in an instant, as if instinct with one spirit, the whole congregation sunk down to the ground. And Reed is expressing in his writing that, like, he is taken by the emotion, and he is taken by like the impact, the call of God that he felt during that moment. And it's describing that maybe this is real. People are having these real encounters with God. even coming from someone who didn't believe that it was, that's not the way things are done. That's not how people shouldn't come to God because of an emotional connection. They should come to God because of a steady and well thought out belief. And then he, even he was taken in by how he felt the call of God in the meeting. So really interesting. They're not just also on the frontier. These are also happening in urban areas. Sometimes a camp meeting would be like nearby an urban center if we're like back in the kind of like the old Northeast. But also just maybe not a camp meeting, but an urban revival where meetings are taking place in cities too. So all over the country. A unique thing about the Second Great Awakening is that there was an emphasis on equality. African Americans were participating, sometimes even speaking at these meetings, being able to share their call for not only salvation, but also for justice, for reform, for abolition specifically. And also women were participating and leading prayer meetings and being able to be part of the services and influential. And young people and women formed the majority of the converts during services. So young people like under 25 were a big part of those who would come forward during meetings, but also women. And so I think the statistics is like 3 women for every 2 men who became Christians during a camp meeting. So this is going to lead to, outside of the meetings themselves or outside of the preaching, to a renewed church membership. So a lot of churches are growing during this time period, but also led to like community organizations. So societies forming of people who wanted to pray or wanted to like focus on abolition or focus on supporting people in need. That action piece of what do we do with our newfound faith? We live it out. So the Second Great Awakening is going to cause a growth in a lot of these churches, like the Methodist Church, Baptist Church, Presbyterian. I didn't write this one, but Congregational. There's a lot of growth in these different churches, and a lot of these denominations will start to found a lot of colleges. So about half of the colleges in the nations that were in existence by 1860 were founded by these denominations. And so there's a lot of, especially in the Midwest, there's a lot of these colleges that maybe today are secular, but when they were first founded were Christian, were founded by one of these denominations. One of the more influential pastors during the Second Great Awakening, his part of it was like during the latter half. So if the Second Great Awakening lasts from the late 1790s through to at least the mid 1830s, some would say all the way through like the 1850s, at least in some areas. But Charles Finney is active throughout the 1820s and the 1830s. But he is exemplary of the part of the movement that is criticized by scholars or historians or even people at the time. Again, just like Andrew Reed, that preacher believed that this is too emotional. It's got to be man-made. It's got to be like they're purposely trying to make people feel a certain way. And there is an element to that because Charles Finney and his organization did have like very specific instructions for it. To hold a camp meeting, you do this, you do this, you do this. You create the space in the front for people to come forward to have an emotional experience, and trying to use a formula for coming up with a way to do this so that people will react a certain way and the movement will spread, and that people will find Christ. So there is a I think he did want people to find Christ, but people would criticize like the formulaicness of it and the way that it was overly emotional. But at the same time, some 100,000 people came forward and became Christians as a result of Charles Finney's preaching during this time, which is why he's one of the more famous of the whole movement. And when studies are done looking at like, okay, so of all these people that became Christians during his camp meetings, how many were still, an active church participant in later years? And they ultimately found that actually most people were still attending churches years later. So it didn't end with just one emotional night at a camp meeting. He's also criticized for some of his theological stances, like, and this gets down into the weeds of like, what do you believe in terms of like predestination and God's like what salvation, where salvation originates. Is it from like we have to do something to get to turn towards God, or is it that God has already turned toward us? And this whole like Calvinist and versus Arminian debate that churches, a lot of churches have separated over in the past. So I don't need to get it too much into the weeds of that, but just know that some people do criticize some of his personal theology, and also some of the ways in which maybe they used a formula. But I would say that, there's a lot of churches that follow some kind of a formula, like how many songs do we sing at the beginning of a church service? How do we organize the what the pastor is saying? Are we going to use alliteration? What are we going to do so that people remember what we're saying? Are we going to have these midweek meetings for people? And none of it is necessarily bad. In fact, a lot of it is actually really good to be able to provide opportunities for people to connect with others and to connect with God. But just so you know, the Second Great Awakening is looked upon by some scholars as being man-made revival rather than legitimate revival. I would argue that based on its actions and based on what happens as a result, it's there's that very well may be true for some people, but it is also a massive real revival that took place in America in the early 1800s and led to lasting consequences, not just for the churches, but also for like what reform movements do people start getting into as a result. So we'll take a look at some of those. The Second Great Awakening sparks a lot of reform movements. I'm going to concentrate on 3, especially in the North, but also other places. And the biggest one is going to be the support of abolition. And many supporters join the abolition movement as a result of kind of like a heart change during the Second Great Awakening. So abolitionism would be the first one, like advocating for the end of slavery. At first, the movement is more about persuading owners to release slaves voluntarily, like persuading them to basically believe in the need to end slavery. But then it also becomes, and especially towards the latter part of the antebellum era, it becomes about we need to actively get the country to get rid of slavery. And so there are vehement calls for abolition. The picture of the newspaper that I have to the side is another excerpt that not this exact excerpt, but that newspaper, I was going to have you read a piece of it, by William Lloyd Garrison, who is the owner and editor of this newspaper, basically entirely dedicated towards abolition and spreading why abolition was so important. Another reform movement that takes off is temperance. This belief in the need to end alcoholism and alcohol consumption entirely. Like the dangers of alcohol are just so awful for society. The dangers of drunkenness, and also a belief on the other side that sobriety was holy. This is another part of the Second Great Awakening that I didn't really talk about, but part of that action piece a lot of people took away from it was this belief that we need to like perfect ourselves. So if we are called by God, if we are really his children, then we are working on being the best version of ourselves. But it went even farther than that. In some areas, people actually set up this whole there's a whole area of the country where it becomes a really like perfectionist goal that we will make ourselves perfect, and like through God's help, but we will become perfect for Christ and because of Christ, and we will usher in like the second coming of Christ. That's a whole nother area of it that's mostly tied to New England. But anyway, some of that is related here. Like sobriety, getting rid of alcohol use in someone's life would be part of perfecting oneself, and that also it's just bad for society to have people who are pulled away from their families because of alcohol consumption. So anyway, the temperance movement gets really big, but it never is very effective for obvious reasons, because there's a lot of people that don't want to give up alcohol, whether it's because of an addiction to alcohol or because just a lot of people can control alcohol use, and it's such a big part of social gatherings, not just in this time period, but in many time periods. So this isn't going to go anywhere until the 1920, but it is definitely out there as an idea. And especially women are the ones who are promoting temperance, because they can see how if the man of a family is addicted to alcohol and gets drunk all the time, how devastating that is for the family unit, for the woman and the children who can't take care of their family, can't if all the money is dwindling away in alcohol use. That's really negative, obviously, really dangerous. So the other one would be women's rights movements, and this is also picking up. It's going to be a smaller, less people involved in this movement, but still growing. Women often took leading roles in the reform movements. They took leading roles in some of the camp meetings, and they're taking women leading roles here, advocating for equality, advocating for suffrage. Again, just like temperance, suffrage is not going to be achieved until the end of World War I, but it is definitely being supported, and people are starting to talk about it. Women are starting to fight for it and march for it, although it'll be it's a trickle here in the 1840s, but then it will become a bigger trickle into the 1860s, and then much bigger by the time we get to the 1890s, until it finally is very big by the time we get to World War I. Okay, so those are the reform movements. And that's the last thing I have for you today. So I know that took a long time. I hope that you got something out of it. I'll release the study guide so you can see all of the, all of the stuff from here and where to put it into your study guide, where you can start getting ready for the test. And then remember that this is going to be multiple choice and short answers, so you do want to, practice some of that. So I'll see what I can do about finding some places in your book where you could practice some of those things. Okay, thank you guys. Bye.